The Amistad Research Center is proud to present Conversations in Color, commemorating 1963 March on Washington.
Welcome to Dillard University. On behalf of the Amistad Research Center and Dillard University, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to our campus to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. I'm Rochelle Ford, and I'm the 8th president of Dillard University. But in order to really reflect and to truly celebrate this historic March on Washington, we really must begin by looking back to June 28, 1839. When the schooner La Amistad set sail from Havana, Cuba, with about 53 abducted Africans that were really meant, whose fate was meant for enslavement. However, on that third day out, the captives revolted and ordered the ship to return to Africa. After 2 months adrift at sea, the ship landed along Long Island, New York, where they were jailed for piracy and murder. Christian abolitionists, along with former President John Quincy Adams, interceded on their behalf and took their case to the U.S. Supreme Court, which ruled in favor of the captives and set them free. Nearly 125 years later, on August 28, 1963, more than 250,000 people from all walks of life responded to the call of civil rights. Religious leaders gathered there at the Washington Monument to demand the freedoms that even those captives back 125 years previously never truly got to realize. On August 28, 1963, there was a call from the civil rights and the religious leaders for all of us to come and to gather at the Lincoln Memorial to demand economic justice, voting rights, civil rights, the rights that had been afforded to our white counterparts. For a 3-hour-long event, which included supporters from religious and business communities, it culminated with a meeting between the event leaders and President John F. Kennedy at the White House. It was at this meeting that the president pledged his support to the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts, which were passed after Kennedy's assassination. Despite being filled with hope and optimism for a brighter future, marchers sadly returned home with the same, and in many cases, worsening conditions. But inspired by the speeches they heard at the event, they rallied their families, they rallied their friends, and they continued to march. 60 years later, although we've seen progress, the journey is not over. We have yet to arrive at that destination that Dr. King and so many other leaders spoke about, dreamt about, which is that all men would one day be judged equally by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. And today, too many civil rights violations extend far beyond skin color. And it's not just about continuing to march, it's about continuing to work, it's about continuing in the halls of justice, it's about continuing what we do in the classrooms, it's about continuing to have those conversations at the dinner table, it's about continuing to vote and to exercise that right and to ensure that the districts are drawn in a way that allow all of us to vote and to be really, truly represented in this democracy. So as mothers of color and their babies continue to die at alarming rates because they are denied access to basic health care, we are not done marching. As long as members of the LGBTQ community are denied legislation protecting their rights, as long as the 28 states that their gender identities and their sexual orientations are reason enough for them to be terminated, we are not done marching. As long as unarmed Black men are 7 times more likely to die at the hands of police officers, even when they are unarmed, we are not done marching. As long as Americans with disabilities are denied wheelchair ramps, automatic doors, and parking spaces for the handicapped, we are not done marching. As long as men and women who have served their country in the military are denied employment based on their disabilities, including PTSD, we are not done marching. As long as men and women and children are trafficked and sold into slavery right here in the United States, we are not done marching. As long as obese workers earn up to $100,000 less than their thinner co-workers over the course of their lifespan, we are not done marching. So how do we ensure that our voices are heard? How do we support each other's? Dillard has a plan. Dillard has a plan to be true to our mission of cultivating leaders. Not any kind of leader, but a leader that lives ethically. Not any kind of leader, but a leader who thinks and communicates precisely. Not any kind of leader, but one that acts courageously to make the world a better place. Dillard University has taken the measures that Dr. King said that he wanted to see. We want to bring all of those things to fruition, and we wanted to do that in partnership with our community. Through the Center for Racial Justice, through the newly reinstated Center for Black-Jewish Relations. We are not done working. So the question is, where do we go from here? The best place to start your journey is to make sure that you understand the past, and please be sure that you engage with the Amistad Research Collection here on our fellow campus at Tulane University. There you're going to find artifacts and papers and documents that record the history of slavery as well as race relations. And then I want you to come and continue to engage, to cultivate leaders among each other in partnership with Dillard University. So today we gather here to celebrate, to teach, and most importantly, to remember. And although we've made progress and we've fallen back on other areas, we know that is not simply a dream, but it's a reality that we can obtain if we continue to work together. Welcome.
Great. First of all, thank you all for being here on this beautiful campus on this beautiful afternoon as we celebrate a true moment in history. However, for those of you who have been watching CNN and MSNBC and all the other news stations and watching and listening to our venerable civil rights leaders who are engaged in Washington, D.C. at this very moment, concerning the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington, you'll know that the message in DC, the message here, the message around the country is this is not a commemoration of August 28th, 1963. Today is a continuation of the hard work that all of those people started on August 28th, 1963. So as we continue the work of those marchers, those protesters, those civil rights activists, those ministers, those teachers, those children who all descended on Washington, D.C. The question of the day, the question of the week, the question of the month, the question of the year, the question of the decade is, where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? Now, similar to Dr. Ford, I think if you want to see where you're going, you really do have to look back and see where you've been. Now, where were we as a nation? Where were we as a community? Where were we as people of color on August 28th, 1963? Now, you have the program. The program was beautifully done, and it contains a lot of historical information. So I ask you to look at that right now and also look at it when you leave here today. When you look at the program, which actually has the agenda from that historic march, you'll see that the March on Washington was a march for jobs and freedom. And those marchers made certain demands. And I want to talk briefly about the demands they made and talk about where are we now in regards to the United States of America actually meeting and satisfying the demands made 60 years ago. So let's start first. The marchers demanded meaningful civil rights, not just on paper, not just by words, but civil rights that actually would effectuate equal opportunity and equal rights for all Americans. Dr. Ford talked about the LGBTQ community. She talked about individuals with disabilities. We talk about people of color. That's what civil rights is supposed to be about, effectuating equal opportunities and equal rights for all. So where are we now? Today, we live in a nation that has eviscerated the 1965 Voting Rights Act. In states such as Alabama, it's always Alabama that's causing the problems. Alabama causing the problems then, it's always going to be Alabama causing the problems now. Alabama, despite a mandate from the United States Supreme Court to create and develop a second majority-minority congressional district, this conservative United States Supreme Court mandated it. The Republican legislature has refused to do it. Simply refused a mandate from the U.S. Supreme Court. So where are we now? Second demand by the individuals on August 28, 1963 was full and fair employment. So where are we now with full and fair employment? Based upon systemic discrimination, people of color remain unemployed and underemployed. It's important to know both of those things exist. You can be employed but still be underemployed. Now, there are a lot of news articles in May and June of this year talking about, for the first time in 51 years, there's been a narrowing of the gap of the disparity between Black and white employment. And that's good. That's good. But let's not get way too excited about that. The facts show that large inequities continue in the labor market, and Black workers of color, continue to experience unemployment at twice the rate of white workers. So that's important to bear in mind. Third demand by those marchers, by those protesters, by those civil rights activists, by those heroes and by those heroines on August 28, 1963 was for decent housing. So where are we now with decent housing? In our own city, New Orleans, Louisiana, which is predominantly African American, this city has received an F for the third year in a row concerning affordable housing. An F. Not a C minus, not a D, an F. You failed, you flunked. Dr. Ford, you know what that is? You failed, you flunked. Does not cut it. This city's lack of affordable housing has had ripple effects on everything going on in this city, from homelessness to crime. It impacts every single thing we do. It impacts our entire community. So where are we now? The right to vote. The right to vote. Dr. Ford just talked about it. That is a recurring theme, clearly a recurring theme right now, when we look at the criminal indictments that have ensnared the former president of the United States and all of his allies and cronies. So where are we now as it relates to the right to vote for all U.S. citizens, for everyone, for people of color? Voter suppression is real for people of color. People should stop lying about that. They actually are suppressing our right to vote. It's real, it's fact-driven. Voter purges are real for people of color. Attacks on free and fair elections are real, and that's clearly evidenced by the recent criminal indictments of the former president and his allies in crime. So this right to vote, the right that's fundamental, this is the most fundamental right that all of us have as citizens of these United States of America. That right is illusory for many people that look like me. They also demanded adequate integrated education. So where are we as a nation now with that? Now, I stood at this very podium on this very stage, November 17th, 2022, and I was honored to give the Orteig lecture. And when I did that several months ago, we all knew then that the U.S. Supreme Court was going to dismantle affirmative action. We all knew it. We all knew it was coming. We knew that this conservative Supreme Court would ignore and overrule 50 years of precedent to dismantle affirmative action, because that was the plan. That was the plan under the former president in putting 3 justices on that court. However, what we didn't know, or what I didn't know, what I didn't even suspect then, was that Clarence Thomas, yeah, exactly. It is a joke. I'm glad you laughed. Clarence Thomas, only African-American male on the U.S. Supreme Court, we didn't know then that he would brutally and personally attack the only other African-American justice on the U.S. Supreme Court, the brilliant Justice Kajani Jackson. We didn't know he was going to do that. So he attacks her, and he literally states the following in the affirmative action opinion. As she sees things, he refers to his fellow justice as she. As she sees things, we're all inexorably trapped in a fundamentally racist society with the original sin of slavery and the historical subjugation of Black Americans determining our lives today. Said with disdain and disgust, attacking this brilliant African-American woman justice on the Supreme Court. What we also didn't know then, what I didn't know on November 17, 2022, is that these conservatives, these people that have been trying to erase this country's history as it relates to African Americans and other people of color, that then they would go after the curriculum in our high schools. So now they've gone so far. I'm sure you've all been reading what's going on in Florida, what's going on in Arkansas, where you can't even teach children about the actual history of this country. Because it angers me when people say it's just about African-American history. African-American history is the history of this nation. This nation was built on the backs of African-Americans. So Arkansas, run by whatever her name is, Sarah Huckabee something Sanders, and Florida, run by him, led 2 of the most racist conservative governors in the United States. They would now prohibit high schools from teaching about African-American history. So where are we now? Justice Jackson said in that affirmative action decision, gulf-sized race-based gaps still exist with respect to the health, wealth, and well-being of American citizens. So where do we go from here? I'm left to close with the words of the incomparable Congressman John Lewis, one of my heroes, one of the true icons of the civil rights movement, one of the major players on August 28, 1963. And this quote, which I've used before, is actually probably my favorite quote from Congressman Lewis, because it says where we are and bluntly where we need to go, again, as a community, as a people, and as a nation. Ours is not the struggle of one day, 1 week, or 1 year. Ours is not the struggle of one judicial appointment or presidential term. Ours is the struggle of a lifetime, or maybe even many lifetimes, and each one of us in every generation must do our part. Each one of us must do our part. So that's why we're here today. We need to figure out what is our part. What is it that we need to do? So as we try to figure out where do we go from here, it's a broad question, encompasses a lot. I am proud to be affiliated with and associated with these two outstanding institutions that are putting on this important program today. I am honored to serve on the Board of Trustees of Dillard University. I grew up 8 blocks away. My parents attended Dillard. My parents met at Dillard, and my mother is a Dillard graduate. So I am proud to be part of an institution, and I see President Barrett from Xavier University, and I'm proud to work with Xavier also. These two historically Black universities are educating our best and our brightest. They are making sure that they have an opportunity and a way in this world. So I'm proud to be associated with Dillard. I'm proud to be associated with Xavier University. And I'm also proud to serve as the chair of the board of the Amistad Research Center, along with our executive director, Kathe Hambrick, who has put together this phenomenal program. If you don't know about Amistad, I strongly encourage you to learn, and thanks for that shout out, Dr. Ford. Amistad tells the stories of the African diaspora. There is no story concerning American history that the Amistad does not tell. We hold the papers of those historians. We hold the memorabilia of these people who were actually in the march, actually in the movement, actually involved in everything. So I'm honored to be here today. I'm honored for all of y'all to be here today. I'm honored to be here with our 2 speakers. So thank you all for coming, and I think we'll turn it over.
Risking your life and the courageous activity. Mr. Ronnie, you've been involved in the movement since. And to you, my good friend, just over the past month, I had the honor of having lunch and talking with Dodie, Smith-Simmons. Thank you so much for your service, your courageous service. If you can hear the story about Kathe on the dark streets of Boyle, she will tell you that we will never tell you. We'd like to present this medal of honor to you also.
So my first question, Mr. Moore, what was your first involvement in the civil rights movement, and how old were you?
Well, there were basically 2 steps. First of all, I was going to All Saints Catholic School in Algiers, along with Rudy Lombard. By the way, Rudy Lombard was, we were elementary school together. We ended up at Plaquemine, but we were arrested because the park across the street from the school was segregated, and we were playing in the streets. That was like a one-day experience, but that was my first encounter with the law and segregation. And the next piece that involved my life, I just discussed that the other day, Earl Amity was running for assistant district attorney. You may remember that. And we were working in his campaign. And he didn't win that race, but he endorsed the guy in the runoff, and he became the first assistant district attorney in the state of Louisiana. And being a poor kid, I went on to Southern University. I just wanted to go to school. And the core people from New Orleans followed me to Baton Rouge. And they said, y'all should be doing something about segregation. And we did something about it. We desegregated the lunch counters, and 21 of us were arrested and expelled from the university.
So how old were you when you went to desegregate that park? What was your earliest encounter?
I was 15.
15 years old. Do you mind telling the audience how old you are now?
82. I'll be 83 in December.
So, Mrs. Smith-Simmons, I'd like to ask you the same question. What was your first involvement in the civil rights movement, and how old were you?
Well, it's a strange story. I had no interest in civil rights. It was my older sister, Dodie, who was amongst the students to desegregate LSUNO, which is now. I got involved in civil rights because I wanted to go dancing. My sister Dodie had joined the NAACP Youth Council, and they would meet every Tuesday at Reverend Burrell's church on Dumaine and Galvez. One night, I overheard my sister in a conversation with one of the Thompson sisters, who two of them had also desegregated LSUNO. And they were talking about going to the Golden Pheasant after the meeting. For 25 cents, they put in the jukebox and got 6 tunes and danced the night away. So I say to my sister, if you don't take me to the next meeting, pay my $1 membership dues, and pay my 14-cent car fare, I'm going to tell Mama. Because our mom had said, come straight home after the meeting. And every Tuesday night, there was a story that, oh, we missed the bus, or the bus was late coming. So she did. She was going to all these meetings, and I never, ever wanted to go with her until I heard that they were going to the Golden Pheasant. So if you ask me today to tell you something that was said at the NAACP Youth Council meeting, I couldn't tell you. I didn't pay attention to what Raphael was saying. I didn't care. I just wanted the meeting to be over so we can go dancing. Until one Tuesday night, I don't know if you remember the name or the face of Rudy Lombard and Jerome Smith, who had just recently organized the New Orleans chapter of the Congress of Racial Equality, and had started picketing and sitting in at Woolworths and McCrory's on Canal Street. They had come to ask the NAACP Youth Council to help them with their picketing and sit-in. And we did. And I thought, this is something I can really get into. So at the time, I was 15, almost 16 years old, and I got started in civil rights from wanting to go dancing.
Wow, that's incredible. So my next question, Mr. Moore, where were you the week before the march, and where were you the day of the march? And if each of you could tell me, if you went to the march, who was with you? How did you get there? What did you eat on the way? There were no fast food places, no McDonald's, I would imagine, or Burger King, or any of those kind of places to get from Louisiana to Washington, D.C. So, Mr. Moore first, where were you the week before the march? And where were you the day of the march?
Well, in the Blackaman story, you'll soon find out that there was a march and protest on August 19th. That protest ended up with over 200 people being arrested. And so we were in jail from the 19th past the March on Washington, which was on the 28th. And we didn't, James Farmer wouldn't leave because because he got arrested with us to go introduce Martin Luther King in Washington. So we were all in jail. And we were watching the march on a little black and white TV. I sort of bribed the sheriff to bring a TV to the jail so we could see the march by telling him that we're going to keep the protest at Plaquemine and we're not coming down here to Pleasant Parish. But James Farmer would like to see the march and he brought black and white TV from his house to the jail.
And so as we will see towards the end of the film, you'll actually see James Farmer speaking from the jailhouse in Donaldsonville, where how many of you were in that jail cell where James Farmer was supposed to introduce Martin Luther King at the March on Washington. And for those of you who have a program book, on page 4 is the actual program book that we house in the collection at the Amistad Research Center. So you can see the actual itinerary with James Farmer's name on it. So who else was in that jail cell with you and James Farmer?
Well, there were 5 of us originally: W.W. Harlow, Dr. Bertrand Tyson, Reverend Jetson Davis, James Farmer, and I were originally in there. But Dr. Tyson, told me encouraged him to leave jail, as well as W.W. Harlow. So the 3 of us were actually in jail the day of the march. Bertrand Tyson had to go out to take care of the injured people. He was the only black doctor in Iberville Parish. And W.W. Harlow had to hurry up and get back to class before he loses his job and some other things like that. Plus, he was going to direct a bus we sent from Plaquemine to the March on Washington during that time. It's immediately after the march, we were released, and they had a rally at the church, and that rally didn't turn out right.
And we will see that rally. We'll see it. Was that Plymouth Rock Baptist Church?
Yeah, the Plymouth Rock Baptist Church was actually a tear gas bomb with the folks there, and they started a house-to-house search because they wanted to pick up James Farmer and Jetson Davis, the pastor of the church. By the way, Jetson Davis is the brother of A.L. Davis, and he was, it was a search from him and Ed May. The local people got together and said, we got to get you guys out of town. And they arranged through Good Citizens Funeral Home, which is down there in Plaquemine, to put us in a hearse and to get out of town. And we made it back to New Orleans. So the developments after the march, which were more significant in time and in local significance there than it was the march itself. The march was one day count, but the movement, as you well know, was 60 years.
Wow, which brings us to where we are now. Yes. So you mentioned Reverend A.L. Davis, and Reverend Davis was the president of the SCLC here in New Orleans. Is that correct?
Yes.
Was he also a member of CORE?
No, he was not a member of CORE. He was a supporter of CORE, but not a member.
And so you told me a story. Tell us how you ended up going to the march. And I understand your parents didn't really want you to go.
Well, it's not only my parents, because I had some clerical experience. They stuck me in this Southern Regional Office of CORE. And I was getting all of these WAP lines messages from people working on border registration in Louisiana and Mississippi, and they were all excited about going to the March on Washington. And I kept saying to myself, I really would like to go. One afternoon, after I got off work from working in the Southern Regional Office, I was on my way home, and I usually got off the bus, I forget, the Jackson Avenue bus, and caught the Desire bus. But for some reason, I got off on Canal Street, got on the streetcar, got off on Galvez Street, got on the Galvez bus, took the bus to Galvez and Dumaine, walked over to 917 North Torrentee, which we call Freedom House, was the house of Virgie and Johnny B. Castle. And I knocked on the door. Doratha opened the door and say, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I want to go to the March on Washington." She said, "But you can't go." I said, "But I want to go." She said, "Dodie, you can't go." And I said, "I want to go." And she at the time was having a meeting with Reverend A.L. Davis. And Reverend A.L. Davis was sitting on the sofa. He got up and he said, "Young lady, you look like you really want to go." And I say, "I do." He said, "Hold on a minute." Went in the back, used the castle's phone, came back and said, "Get the things ready, you're going." Reached in his pocket, pulled out a wad of bills, peel off $100 and gave to me and say, "Go home and get ready." So that's how I got to the March on Washington. The person he had called was Clarence Chink Henry, who was president of the Black Longshoremen ILA Union. And Chink Henry was the vice president of SCLC at the time. And they had a bus that was going. So I guess the call to Chink Henry was to see if there was a seat available for me. And there was. Unlike what I imagined the people in the movement was going to be like, on the bus singing freedom songs, having a good time, I was on a bus of strangers. I knew no one on the bus. No one knew me. On the ride to D.C., nobody talked to me. I talked to nobody. When we got there, we went to a hotel, freshened up, and was taken to the mall where the March on Washington was taking place. And while King was giving his speech, I had a dream. And I was saying, while you're dreaming, I'm having nightmares. As you heard Ronnie talk about former being in jail in Louisiana. Well, how he got there, when Ronnie said they took a limousine the back way out of Plaquemine, got back to New Orleans. They put out an arrest warrant for James Farmer. And he turned himself in. I was saying, "Please, Uncle Jim," to myself, "don't turn yourself in." But he thought that was the right thing to do, so he turned himself in. Knowing that they were trying to kill him just days earlier, I didn't know, not like today, you all got cell phones. You could go to your cell phone or iPhone or whatever and know what's going on in a minute's time. Well, we didn't have that back then. So I didn't know whether or not Farmer was dead or alive. But just out of nowhere, I didn't know I was thinking or feeling that way about Farmer, that it just came out. And people looked at me like I was crazy. But that's that.
Well, it's what a wonderful opportunity it is for us to hear you tell your side of the story. So often women's stories have been left out of the civil rights movement, the stories behind the scenes.
Well, with New Orleans C.O.R.E, women and girls were the backbone of the movement. And I think, not only in New Orleans C.O.R.E, but New Orleans C.O.R.E was the only organization that had a female chairperson. And SNCC, led by men, NAACP, led by men. SCLC, led by men. But CORE had women. I was the fourth and last chairperson of New Orleans CORE.
And that's why we have you here today.
Thank you.
And Ronnie, you know, the myth of the hearse, and I hate to keep going back to the story of the hearse, but you know, my family's in the funeral home business. But to know that everybody in the community, or maybe not everybody, but people were looking out for you. You told me an interesting story. You said, well, first of all, how many of you were in the back of a hearse? I know you guys know what the back of a hearse looks like. How many of you were in the back of the hearse? And then you said something about there was a detour hearse. Can you explain that so it's no longer a myth?
In the hearse that went from Plaquemine to New Orleans, there were three: James Farmer, Jetson Davis, and me. The other hearse didn't have anybody in it. They sent from Plaquemine to Baton Rouge, and that was the decoy to get past the state troopers, because they sort of lined up Highway 1. Not that they were looking for the hearse, but if they were going after one, they were going after that one. But we came down the back road into New Orleans. The real story is what happened after the hearse. Reverend Jetson Davis said, I better go back and pastor whatever church I got out there at Plaquemine that's probably down of tear gas. James Farmer was saying, well,